Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Today we're going to be taking a look at the text of 2 Chronicles chapter 30. No doubt you've heard the old cliche, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And you can apply that to a whole litany of things. There are sometimes things in our lives that we take for granted, and then when they're gone, when we don't have access to those things, we really start to lament them. We miss them. We wish we had them back. It could be a person, it could be a favorite thing in your life, but also there are spiritual blessings that sometimes we take for granted, and sometimes we don't have access to those spiritual blessings. And those things that we've taken for granted spiritually, when they're missing, well, we start to miss them. And that's what's happened, I think, during the 2 months that we've spent in a quasi-lockdown because of the coronavirus that's been going through the world. Let me ask you something. When is the last time that God has quickened your pulse? What I mean is, when's the last time that you walked through the doors of your house of worship and you were really excited to be there? You couldn't wait to participate in all the things that are worship. You couldn't wait to see your brothers and sisters in Christ. You couldn't wait to encourage them and to be encouraged yourself. When was the last time God quickened your pulse? For the people in our text, it had been far too long. If you know your Israelite history, you know that throughout their history, they had a terrible, terrible habit of forsaking God, forgetting His law, and leaving the worship that they were supposed to be doing regularly far behind. Now, arguably, Hezekiah was one of the greatest kings that Judah, the southern kingdom, ever had, which is pretty amazing considering that his father Ahaz was a pretty bad guy. He was a wicked king. He was an idolater and all kinds of bad things. Hezekiah also saw the fall in his lifetime of the northern kingdom Israel. And he also knew the reason why they had fallen. God had finally had enough of their disobedience and their rebellion, and He allowed the Assyrians to overtake them and conquer their land. When Hezekiah became king at the death of his father Ahaz, Hezekiah wasted no time in making a lot of wrong things right. He reopened the temple. He repaired the temple. And one of the most important things that he did, aside from a bunch of important reforms that he instituted, was he brought back one of the most important things that had been missing for a long time: their corporate worship. They neglected it for far too long. 2 Chronicles 30 tells us something about that. Let's read about first the call to worship. In 2 Chronicles 30, beginning in verse 1, it tells us that now Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should come to the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover to Yahweh, God of Israel. For the king and his princes and all the assembly in Jerusalem had decided to celebrate the Passover in the second month, since they could not celebrate it at that time because the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient numbers, nor had the people been gathered to Jerusalem. Thus, the thing was right in the sight of the king and all the assembly. So they established a decree to circulate a proclamation throughout all Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, that they should come to celebrate the Passover to Yahweh God of Israel at Jerusalem, for they had not celebrated it in great numbers as it was prescribed. The couriers went through all Israel and Judah with letters from the hand of the king and his princes, even according to the command of the king, saying, O sons of Israel, return to Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that He may return to those of you who escaped and are left from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your fathers or your brothers, who were unfaithful to Yahweh, God of their fathers, so that He made them a horror as you see. Now, do not stiffen your neck like your fathers, but yield to Yahweh and enter His sanctuary, which He has consecrated forever, and serve Yahweh your God, that His burning anger may turn away from you. For if you return to Yahweh, your brothers and your sons will find compassion before those who led them captive and will return to this land. For Yahweh your God is gracious and compassionate, and he will not turn his face from you if you return to him. So the couriers passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, and as far as Zebulun, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them. Nevertheless, some men of Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. The hand of God was also on Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the princes commanded by the word of Yahweh. And we'll stop there. There's something interesting that's going on here. I want you to notice with me in verse 5. The New King James translates verse 5 in this way: they had not done it for a long time in the prescribed way. Now the it was the celebration or the commemoration of the Passover feast. The implication in verse 5 is that it had been long past since they had done things the way that God had wanted them to. Now, the decision for them to do it in the second month maybe was from the allowance in the law of Moses, where if someone was not able to celebrate the Passover in the first month, the 14th of the first month, which is when it was supposed to be celebrated, they would have the opportunity to do so in the second month, on the 14th of the second month. But I want us to see that their desire, their deep desire to worship God, to observe this feast, they may have been thinking, well, better late than never, and better late than not at all. They wanted to do it. They had missed the time, but they were intent on keeping it, and they wanted to do it. I want you to notice something also. It tells us that all were invited, all were welcome, even those in the northern kingdom. Now, there had been division between the northern and the southern kingdom for a long time. And we talked about how in Hezekiah's lifetime he had seen the northern kingdom fall. But yet he sent out invitations to those of the northern kingdom, begging them to come back to God, and if they would, God would certainly see that and he would do something for them. I want you to see that even those with whom they had had some serious differences with in the past were invited. All were invited. All were welcome. Though it says that some of them who had gotten the invitation laughed the couriers and mocked them, scorned them to shame, it says, still there were some who were willing to do that. They were willing to come. Pardon me. Next, I want you to see not just the call to worship, but finally the conditions of worship as it actually occurs. In verse 13 of 2 Chronicles 30, read with me. It says, "Now many people were gathered at Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of unleavened bread in the second month, a very large assembly. They arose and removed the altars which were in Jerusalem. They also removed all the incense altars and cast them into the brook Kidron. Then they slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th of the second month. And the priests and Levites were ashamed of themselves and consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings to the house of Yahweh. They stood at their stations after their custom, according to the law of Moses, the man of God. The priests sprinkled the blood which they had received from the hand of the Levites. For there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levites were over the slaughter of the Passover lambs for everyone who was unclean, in order to consecrate them to Yahweh. For a multitude of the people, even many from Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun, had not purified themselves. Yet they ate the Passover otherwise than prescribed. For Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, May the good Yahweh pardon everyone who prepares his heart to seek God, Yahweh God of his fathers, though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary. So Yahweh heard Hezekiah and healed the people." The first thing that they did was they removed the profane. Verse 14 tells us that they arose and they removed the altars. Now, a lot of these altars had been in place by Hezekiah's own father Ahaz. I told you before that Ahaz was an idolater, and so these were altars that had been set up to honor false gods, to honor idols. But I want you to realize there was no sentimentality for Hezekiah, even though these things had been placed there by his own dad, by his own father. Even if his father had set it up, he knew it was wrong, and he wanted it taken down. He knew that it needed to be removed. And so they removed those profane altars from among themselves. Second, I want you to notice the sacrifices. There were lots of sacrifices. Verse 15 tells us about the slaughtering of the Passover lambs on that day. Worship in those days was a bloody business. There were lots of sacrifices going on. There was lots of blood everywhere, and the priests and the Levites who were assisting in this would be drenched, covered in the blood of those sacrifices. But I want you to realize there were spiritual sacrifices as well. The tribes mentioned in verse 18, Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, those were northern tribes. There were tribes that had been estranged from the true worship of God for a long time. And yet it tells us that they came, and even though they knew they were ceremonially or ritually unclean, yet they wanted to participate in this. They had just been through a heart-rending kingdom conquer by the Assyrians, but yet they wanted to turn to God. They offered the spiritual sacrifice of humility. And notice also what Hezekiah does. He prays on their behalf. He offers petitions to God for pardon. Verses 18 through 20 again remind us of the uncleanness of those who were participating in this event. And Hezekiah prayed for them. He acknowledged the fact that they weren't as they ought to be. But yet, he leaned on God's mercy. He knew everything was not as it should be, and he knew the only remedy was to lean utterly on God's mercy. And it tells us that God heard and God healed. Finally, I want you to notice with me the consequences of that worship. Beginning in verse 21, we read that the sons of Israel present in Jerusalem celebrated the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days with great joy. Now, unleavened bread was synonymous with the Passover. They were two different observances, but they happened one right after the other, and so they were usually just tied together. It tells us, again, the sons of Israel present in Jerusalem celebrated the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days with great joy. And the Levites and the priests praised Yahweh day after day with loud instruments to Yahweh. Then Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to all the Levites who showed good insight in the things of Yahweh. So they ate for the appointed 7 days, sacrificing peace offerings and giving thanks to Yahweh God of their fathers. Then the whole assembly decided to celebrate the feast another 7 days. So they celebrated the 7 days with joy. For Hezekiah, king of Judah, had contributed to the assembly 1,000 bulls, 7,000 sheep, and the princes had contributed to the assembly 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep, and a large number of priests consecrated themselves. All the assembly of Judah rejoiced, with the priests and the Levites and all the assembly that came from Israel, both the sojourners who came from the land of Israel and those living in Judah. So there was great joy in Jerusalem, because there was nothing like this in Jerusalem since the days of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Then the Levitical priests arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came to his holy dwelling place, to heaven. Wow. What a worship experience that must have been. We read where they were so excited to do it that they decided to do it for another week. 2 consecutive weeks of praise and worship and rejoicing in God every day, all day. I want you to notice how often joy is mentioned in this passage. Several times it tells us that they did this with great joy. The people rejoiced and they experienced joy. In verse 23, they celebrated the 7 days with joy. Again and again, we find the attitude of the people in this, one to be one of being uplifted, of turning themselves to God and experiencing what relationship with God ought to inspire in those who worship Him. Also, notice also the encouragement that they received. Verse 22 tells us that Hezekiah spoke encouragingly. But I'm sure also that it wasn't just Hezekiah who gave encouragement. It was each one who was worshiping who encouraged the other. Everybody knew how important mutual encouragement was, and they gave it. Finally, also realize that in spite of all the imperfections of this late worship, in spite of the fact that they hadn't done it for a long time. In fact, it tells us that there was nothing like this since the days of Solomon, hundreds of years before. I want you to notice verse 27 tells us that God accepted it. It tells us their prayer came to His holy dwelling place, to heaven. The implication is that God heard and He was pleased. Now, as we think about the worship that was offered on this day, so long ago, let's make some application to our present time. We have been through various stay-at-home orders, and it's taken a toll on some folks spiritually. It's been a long time since we've been able to meet together. And on Sunday, May 17th, 2020, the church with whom I worship, the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas, will come back together. We'll do all kinds of safety precautions. We'll have disinfected our building. We will do safe distancing from one another. But we will come back together. And it had been far too long since we've been able to do this together. 2 months without coming together as a spiritual family to worship God. Now, we've been looking for innovative ways to do it, to come together in other ways. We've met online. Sometimes we've met in smaller groups in homes, and all of that is great. It's fine, but it's not, as we noticed in verse 5, in the manner prescribed. God intends for us to be together. Hebrews 10, verse 23 through 25 tell us, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For He who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Now, God grouped us in local families, in local churches for a reason. Togetherness is important. We encourage one another. We help one another when we feel like wavering. It's been a long time, and it's good to be back together again. Second, notice also the sacrifices are important. We saw in our text about the thousands of animals that were offered in sacrifice. Now, maybe you are not offering a bull or a sheep to be sacrificed, but there are spiritual sacrifices that you make when you decide to go back to worship with those whom you haven't seen in a long time. Chances are you might feel a little apprehensive. You might wonder if it's safe to go back out in public and to mix in close proximity with others. And you may have to fight fear in order to do that. That's a sacrifice of its own. But there are many ways in which we offer spiritual sacrifices to our God. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, "You also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." Our sacrifices, whether it's our time, our talent, or our treasure, those sacrifices mean something to us, and they certainly mean something to God. They matter. thirdly, realize that worship should revitalize you. We saw the joy in our text of those who hadn't done it for a long time and the exuberance, the enthusiasm with which they worship God. Now, it's been a long time for us, as we mentioned. And for some, it's been a time of isolation. I know personally of some folks who haven't had any contact with anybody else, haven't even left their house for a couple of months. And those kind of things take a toll on people. In our text, there was singing of praise, there was prayer, there was instruction, and joy. Lots of joy. Well, that's what worship ought to mean for us. Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and in verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." For those who hunger and thirst for devotion and love and the giving of themselves to God, nothing but worship will do. It's been a long time, and we haven't done it in a long time. But it's so good to be able to get back together and give to God the praise and the devotion that he not only demands, but that he certainly deserves. I hope that you and your congregation will be together soon if you're not already. And I hope that we will find our way back to regular worship to our God. I hope you have a good day. God bless you.